zu rächen. So du willst, Herr, Sünde zu rächen. So du willst, Herr, Sünde zu rächen. So du willst, Herr, Sünde zu rächen. Herr, so du willst Sünde zu rächen. So du willst Sünde zu rächen.
The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, "Those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire." When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Then I said, "Lord, God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes be open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you, day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly towards you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, 'If you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant, and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man." I was cupbearer to the king.
So du willst, Herr, Sünde zu rächen. 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 Herr, so du willst Sünde zu rächen. So du willst Sünde zu rächen. Herr, wer wird bestehen? Wer wird bestehen? Wer wird bestehen?
So we're starting a new series this week in the Old Testament book of Nehemiah. Now, in many ways, Nehemiah is an odd little book. Before the Reformation in the 16th century, Nehemiah was included with Ezra. In fact, it was known as First Ezra, and Ezra was Second Ezra, but it's definitely still in the history category of Hebrew Scripture. This is largely a first-person account of Nehemiah, a Jew who serves in the Medo-Persian court. It's the story of how the walls of Jerusalem were rebuilt after the previously exiled Jews returned from the Babylonian captivity. And as we will be in this book for the next 8 weeks, it's absolutely vital that we get the historical context right before we find the meaning and the application that flows from this text. Today will be just that, the historical setting that Nehemiah is in, the events that lead up to this point, and the relationship that Israel had with the ancient Near Eastern world. As we go through, you'll understand that maybe this doesn't have as much relevance for you, particularly in the message today, but we need to understand these sorts of things so that we come back week by week and we'll think, oh, okay, I know exactly what's going on here, or at least I know kind of what's going on here. We're going to start with Israel's history in the year 1050 BC. 1050 BC, it's approximately in that year when Israel got her first king. And you may recall that Israel's first king is named Saul. When this Saul character begins his reign, he starts off pretty well with the people of Israel, but rather quickly he becomes arrogant, he becomes conceited, he becomes incredibly self-justifying. So what Saul does a lot is to make some really big mistakes, doing exactly the opposite of what God told him to do, and he's always justifying himself. So eventually God removes him from being the king, and the next king God puts on the throne is King David. King David, obviously, many of you know King David. He starts off as a shepherd boy. There's these amazing stories about him killing bears and lions, protecting his sheep. He, of course, goes up against Goliath. He's a musician. He writes songs. He's altogether a remarkable person. And undoubtedly, David is Israel's greatest king, reigning from about the year 1010 BC to 970 BC. And so if you're ever thinking about how all this history fits together, if you go, oh, David reigned roughly around 1000 BC, well, that's always a good sort of hook to hang things on. Now, David himself was far from perfect. If you know his story, you know that he was an adulterer, he was a murderer, he didn't deal with his children very well. But the thing that distinguished him over and over again, the thing that distinguishes him from Saul, is that when he's confronted with his sin, he repents time and time again. It's a profound thing, so that even though this was not an overly virtuous man a lot of the time, we still see that about him is written that this was a man after God's own heart. Eventually, of course, David dies and his son Solomon becomes king. Now, Solomon's great achievement is that he gets to build the temple of God. Up until this point, the Ark of the Covenant, sort of the symbol of God's divine presence among his people, that was housed in a tent. It was in the tabernacle. Solomon gets to build a permanent structure in Jerusalem. And Solomon, he starts off his reign quite satisfactory as well. God gives him this sort of incredible wisdom, gives him incredible wealth, but he's got a bit of a problem. He likes to make alliances, some would say deals, with foreign powers. And a lot of those foreign alliances had to do with intermarriage, that is to say, marrying someone from another kingdom. Solomon ends up with about 700 wives and 300 concubines. So he's got a bit of some issues there. I would think perhaps commitment issues or a lack of commitment issue. And so one of the things that happens with these foreign women is they don't become followers of Solomon's God. They continue to worship their own gods from whatever kingdom they came from. That leads Solomon astray, and he starts worshiping those gods as well. Solomon dies, and his son Rehoboam becomes king, and this is where we need to really start paying attention. Rehoboam becomes king over all of Israel. And maybe for a helpful visual, picture this sanctuary, this church sanctuary, as the entire kingdom of Israel. So let's pretend that all these places up here, the pulpit, the organ, the choir, up here is north, and the congregation where you're sitting, if you were in fact in church, the pews and such, you're south. If you know anything about the geography of Hancock, where we are, it's exactly the opposite, but for today we'll pretend that this is north and that's south. Well, Rehoboam becomes king, and the people say to him, Rehoboam, your father Solomon, we really appreciate everything that he did for us, but he was a hard master. Could you just give us a bit of a break? We're a bit tired. And so what Rehoboam does, he says, okay, well, let me consult some of my people. First of all, he goes to his father's officials, the elder statesmen, and he says to them, what should I do about the people's request? His father's advisors say to him, you serve the people and the people will serve you. That sounds like pretty good advice. You serve the people and the people will serve you. But Rehoboam isn't exactly excited about this advice, and so he goes to his own advisors, who we find out incidentally are the guys he grew up with. They're his entourage, his hangers-on, if you will, and they like hanging out with the prince, even more so now that he's king. And so their advice, their counsel is sort of an incredulous chuckle. Serve the people? You got to be kidding me. No, you're the king. They serve you. That's how it works. Take advantage of it. And so Rehoboam comes back to his people and he says, if you thought my father was a tough ruler, you ain't seen nothing yet. That becomes the official policy of the kingdom. The northern kingdom, the northern tribes, that's me in this whole area up here, they entirely revolt against him. There's a civil war. What ends up happening is that the once united kingdom of Israel is split in two. The north continues to be called the kingdom of Israel, while the southern kingdom is now called Judah. Rehoboam, he's king of Judah. That's the south. That's all of you, if you were in fact sitting in the congregation. And up here, there's a chap called Jeroboam, who rules over the breakaway kingdom of Israel, or maybe the rump state of Israel, who knows. And might I say it's really unhelpful that these two fellows have rhyming names, Rehoboam and Jeroboam. It'd be much easier if one was called Jerry or something like that, but there you have it. Now, for you in the south, in the congregation, your capital city is Jerusalem. The capital city up here is Samaria. So we've got the north, we've got the south, we've got a divided kingdom. All of my kings up here, all of Israel's kings, every single one of them, are very bad at kinging. They seem all to be terrible kings. Some of them are less terrible than the others. Some of them are just sort of weak and pathetic leaders. Some of them are truly evil. Your kings in the south, however, are not quite as bad. Most of them aren't great. There are a couple of bright spots here and there. Most of them aren't that great, but they're not quite as bad as this kingdom up here. This division lasts for the next 200 years, and that will take us to the year 722 BC. Now, this is actually very important. You may be thinking, you're being completely overwhelmed by names and dates and directions, but this is essential. We have the north and we have the south. We have the northern capital of Samaria, and we have the southern capital of Jerusalem. In 722, one of the neighboring countries, that of Assyria, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, comes in and wipes out the entire northern kingdom. It's gone. The Assyrians, they were a brutal and ferocious people, and history goes on to tell us that almost the entire population of the northern kingdom, except for like the very poorest of poor, They were taken out of the land and resettled in various parts of the Assyrian Empire. And as they were being exiled, other displaced peoples of other regions were brought into this conquered northern kingdom. So we got this geographical area that was once part of a united kingdom of Israel, then broken up while retaining the name Israel, and now it's referred to by its capital city. It's now known simply as Samaria. And we're going to come across Samaritans as we get into the chapters, so we need to know who these people are. And of course, in the New Testament, we find out more about Samaritans. And Samaritans have this whole other type of worship system that's going on. We've got these displaced peoples, they weren't native, along with the few remaining Jews, and these groups start intermarrying with each other. The true Jews, the ethnically pure Jews, they see these generations of Samaritans not as half-Jews, but as the far less charitable term, they see them as half-breeds. There's no respect, there's absolutely no love lost between the two. That's 722 BC. The northern kingdom falls to the Assyrians. Now, in the south, we have the continuation of Judah with its capital city, Jerusalem. There are threats from all sorts of different nations, but in 587 BC, the southern kingdom is conquered by the Babylonians. The capital city, Jerusalem, is just destroyed. The temple is razed to the ground. We see this sort of thing in Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. For there they that carried us away captive required of us a song, and they that wasted us required of us mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. Incidentally, Bach's choral setting to this on Wasserfluss in Babylon, BWV 267, is, in my estimation, the most tender expression of this psalm, and it's well worth a listen. We see this also in the book of Lamentations, people mourning over the fall of Jerusalem. You see, Jerusalem wasn't just the capital city. This wasn't all about politics. It was the place where the temple was. It was the visible presence of God among his people. And to lose that meant losing absolutely everything. It wasn't all political, it was religious, and it was deeply, deeply personal. And so Jerusalem, indeed the whole of Judea, has been conquered by the Babylonians. A further 50 years on, about 50 years later, Babylon itself will be conquered by the Medians, by the Medes and the Persians, under the famed leadership of Cyrus the Great. Now, Cyrus is an interesting character. Most other Near Eastern nations at the time, like Syria, would conquer people, take them away, bring other people in, and just completely crush the population, annihilate the conquered people so that there would be no trace left of their ethnicity. The Babylonians did much the same thing, leaving only the poorest of poor in Judah. Cyrus has a completely different plan. He conquers the Babylonian lands and he thinks, well, there are all these displaced peoples throughout the empire. We ought to start letting them back, at least some of them, to go back to their homelands. They could worship their own gods, and perhaps, just perhaps, a somewhat placated population will be much easier to govern. So that's Cyrus's plan, and he does let some of the people return. They start rebuilding the temple as more and more exiles come back. Cyrus's son comes to power, the son dies. Eventually, the nation is thrown into civil war. Darius becomes the new king, and Darius, allows even more exiles to return, and they finish building the temple. And this was all because of Cyrus's decree. It's interesting, as an aside, this decree was recorded, among other places, on an ancient clay cylinder in cuneiform. And that cylinder was discovered fairly recently in 1879. It was discovered in modern-day Iraq by an archaeologist who was an Assyrian. He was of Assyrian descent. He was a Chaldean Christian and later a British national. And this so-called Cyrus cylinder can be seen today with the rest of the great jewels of antiquity in the British Museum. So the temple, this place signifying God's presence, the temple was being rebuilt in Jerusalem. Now, it wasn't as impressive as the temple, the previous temple, but at least there is now a central place for the Jews to worship. Darius dies, his son Xerxes becomes king, Xerxes dies, and his son Artaxerxes becomes king, and we'll see him in chapter 2, verse 1. So that's where we find ourselves. We're in Israel. Artaxerxes is king over the entire Medo-Persian Empire. The temple in Jerusalem has been built, but the rest of the city is still in ruins. Some of the exiles have returned, and here up north, we're full of Samaritans, and we don't like you in the south, and you don't like us. And that will become more and more clear as we continue on. That's where we find ourselves, in Nehemiah chapter 1. In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa. So Nehemiah, he's not in Jerusalem, he's in Susa, and we see from the last verse of this chapter that he was a cupbearer to the king, to Artaxerxes. Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. Jerusalem and her temple are core to the Jewish identity. It captured all their imagination. Again, to go back to that Psalm 137, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. Zion, the hill, the mountain in the middle of Jerusalem that the temple is built on. And their captors would torment them and say, hey, Jews, why don't you sing us some of those happy songs of Zion? And they weep and they say, well, how can we sing songs of the Lord while we're in this strange land? And this is absolutely gutting for them. Their entire identity is gone, with Jerusalem not being the central point of their nation and their worship. That's where we find ourselves. And so it's a very little surprise that Nehemiah questions people about this. Tell me about Jerusalem. What's going on there? And what he hears just wrecks him. They said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned with fire. And he's absolutely distraught over this news. And let me read to you a couple of passages out of the book of Ezekiel. And this will be key for next week. We'll get into this more next week as we look at the actual prayer of Nehemiah and we see what's going on here. Ezekiel 36 is quite a long chapter, so I'll paraphrase some of it, read bits to you. But God is prophesying to the nation. He's prophesying even to the land. He says, no more will you be desolate. My people will come back and you will be fruitful for them. And then he says this, so I poured out my wrath on them, the people, because they had shed blood in the land and because they had defiled it with their idols. I dispersed them among the nations, and they were scattered through the countries. I judged them according to their conduct and their actions. And wherever they went along the nations, they profaned my holy name. For it was said of them, these are the Lord's people, and yet they had to leave his land. He continues, this is what the sovereign Lord says. On the day I cleanse you from all your sins, I will resettle your towns, and the ruins will be rebuilt. The desolate land will be cultivated instead of lying desolate in the sight of all who pass through it. They will say, this land was once laid waste and has become now like the Garden of Eden. The cities that were lying in ruins, desolate and destroyed, are now fortified and inhabited. Then the nations around you that remain will know that I, the Lord, have rebuilt what was destroyed and have replanted what was desolate. I, the Lord, have spoken, and I will do it. Now, did you catch that in there? The cities that were laying in ruins, desolate and destroyed, are now fortified and inhabited. When does this take place? On the day I cleanse you from all your sin. Nehemiah is waiting for that day. He's hoping for that day. The temple has been rebuilt fairly recently, and he's excited about what might be happening. And he says, what's happening in Jerusalem? And they say, well, the walls are destroyed. The gates are burned with fire. There's nothing going on there. Well, what does that mean? It means that the Lord has not forgiven the sins of his people. They're still being punished. They're still being judged. Nehemiah says, verse 4, when I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. And then he continues on in his prayer. And as we'll see next week, one of the first things he does in his prayer is that he confesses his sins and the sins of his people before his God, because he knows that God forgiving the sins has to do also with God allowing Israel to be rebuilt. Well, I've given you a lot of information today, perhaps too much, and I apologize. But these are the things that we need to understand, because the Samaritans, they're going to, feature prominently in the story. So you need to know who they are. You need to know why Nehemiah and many of these people aren't in the land and why they're going back. What is it that going back and building the walls actually mean? But before we finish, let me just add one pastoral word. Verse 4 again. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Nehemiah has just heard essentially the worst news that he could have imagined. The identity of Israel was everything. I don't know how to explain it strongly enough. I don't think that any of us have, at least in the West, have any sort of concept to that homeland and the capital of the homeland being absolutely everything essential to their identity. Again, it's not just political identity, but especially their religious identity. Nehemiah has just heard news that the worst news he could possibly have imagined. And he sits down and he weeps, But he doesn't stop there. He prays. For many of us, hearing the worst news that we could imagine, whatever that may be, it will certainly cause us to sit down and weep. We will mourn. We will fast, yes. But may I suggest that we need to get to a place of prayer when those moments hit, because they will hit. If we live long enough, they will absolutely hit. So I want to encourage you as you go out this week, if you hear the worst thing that you could possibly hear, to mourn, to weep, but also to pray and to come back next week.